Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I've got some reactions on a video I posted recently about CW and it closing, and kind of my theory of the core problem, other than the general logistical disruption problem that's happening within streaming and everything else, which is a core part of the whole thing, if not the biggest part. But the other topic that I brought up was that there was just too much of the same content. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, the content was too left leaning, the content was too woke, etc. But it's fine, but the content was also the same. Show after show after show, you would tune in and you knew where things were going pretty much from, to the time the initial credits roll, you know what's going to happen in the show. You could predict it. Everything was entirely predictable. And that's because they had one format that they just went with. I also irritated a bunch of fans of some of those shows going, so it's not that predictable. It's fine. And by the way, if you really enjoy the formula, then predictable is probably good. It gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling and everything else. But the problem is then you're just narrowing your audience to a tiny, tiny fraction, which is what they did. So if you look at that though, and I was just thinking about comics in general, and I want to give you an example of one of the areas where I think we do have a problem, and there's little attempts to fix it, but it almost feels like every time there's a couple steps forward, it takes 3 or 4 steps backward at the same time. And that's that a lot of comic content as well feels like the same. If you look at DC or you look at Marvel, you can group the type of stories that you're getting into just a couple different buckets. There's a few people doing new and innovative stuff out there, and got more power to them, but there's a lot of the same. And in many cases, the same, if looked at individually, it's not necessarily bad. If you look at Batman, for example, uh, the stories, you read Detective Comics, and it's okay. It's a solid story. There's not anything super weird about it. It's fine. But then you also have 8 or 9 other Batman titles that are kind of telling the same story. Same pacing, same feel, same almost everything. The art is different, but even there, the art is starting to develop a house style in some cases. There's definitely some unique people out there. But the more it starts to just group together, the more it really doesn't matter if the storyteller is good or bad. It feels like you've read this thing before. And I was thinking about if you turn the dial back to the 80s for just a moment, and you look at what Marvel was doing, and you had the Avengers, and you had the X-Men, and you had Spider-Man, and you had a number of other titles in there as well in that mix. But if you look at those three, you'll see very different titles. One of the complaints was that West Coast Avengers tonally was very different from what was going on in Avengers. And Jim Shooter, in some interviews, has commented on the fact that he would push the different editorial teams if the titles started feeling too similar. He wanted titles to feel distinct. The idea was, hey, we'll reach a broader audience. I mean, imagine that crazy idea. We'll diversify our audience. That's crazy. Anyway, it is funny, by the way. I went and found some articles from, was it the Comic Book Resource newsletter? Is one Peter David used to write for that I'm always forgetting. But Comic Book Resources, maybe that was it. No, that's a website. Anyway, and you see an interview in there with Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter himself talks about diversifying the audience, but he's talking about it from a much different perspective. He's talking about if we create comics with a bunch of different feels to them. If when you read Spider-Man, you shouldn't feel like the exact same story, the exact same plot, the exact same tone that you feel from Uncanny X-Men. And I'll take it further. Lots of people liked the Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Dark Phoenix saga. It's one of the well-regarded storylines in comics. If you had the Avengers and Spider-Man doing the exact same story, some friend of the character gets stronger power, starts to get corrupted. Same, an artist that drew like John Byrne, a storyteller that wrote like Chris Claremont. If you had 3 Dark Phoenix sagas going on at the same time, the original would not have been as loved, even though it. You might say, "Wow, I would always like more of a good thing." It sounds good, But part of what makes it a good thing is its uniqueness. And if you then fast forward to today, you look at Marvel, you look at DC, you look at the comics, and it's a lot of the exact same pacing, plot, and story. I've heard some current creators knock the house style that the big two would use back in the day, but I would argue what's going on today is much more of a house style, both in writing, editorial, and tone, than what we've had in the past. Again, there absolutely are some comics that are doing unique things, and curiously enough, the ones that are doing unique things also tend to get reviewed better, tend to do better, but that message isn't clicking. You look at the X titles under Hickman. One of the problems is that the stories, if you read X Force, if you read Excalibur, if you read X Factor, if you read New Mutants, there was a pacing and a sense of where these stories were going that felt like you were reading the same comic over and over again. Yes, Teenie Howard has a radically different style than Vita Ayala in terms of writing, but the tone, the way the characters talk, the way things were going on in that story, it felt the same. Marauders and X-Force, they didn't feel as different as you would expect. And the more they started to feel the same, the more dissatisfaction started to crop up from the readers. Now, a lot of people who are complaining would say things like woke agenda and all that kind of stuff. But and it's not to say those themes aren't there, but the core underlying problem is that you had very little actual diversity of storytelling, plot, and tone. That is one reason why I do like Jeff Thorne's Green Lantern so much. It is very different. I still maintain, and now you guys will tell me every single time in the comments, and I get it, that you feel as a bait and switch because Joe is in the comic and everything else. To me, the biggest sin of that book it continues to be the covers bear zero responsibility. No responsibility, zero to do with what's going on in that comic. That's the part that continues to frustrate me. But including, by the way, they put out the trade paperback, and what's the cover they pick? That one of Team Lantern yelling at the Guardian, which wasn't in the book. Like, why all these good covers that's the one you picked. Somebody at DC's like, yep, this is the one that's going to move copies, and it's like, man, you're going to piss people off when they open up the book and it bears zero to do with anyway. Wow, whatever. I've been on that soapbox before. I mentioned earlier that sometimes comic companies, sometimes it feels like people take steps forward, only to take several steps backward. Well, one example of that, I think, is in the indie side of the world, where you do have a robust indie market in comics. I don't know about healthy, but robust, meaning there's a lot of them. But in many ways, the indies have the exact same problem. There's way too many of the exact same pitch of story. It's a very similar theme, a very similar tone, and increasingly very similar art. One of the things that I don't see talked about quite a bit, but I notice a lot, is that the people who have very unique art styles tend to get shoved either into doing cover only work, or they just, you don't see them with regular projects come up. A lot of the art that comes out is very, very similar in style, and so all this, I find myself puzzled and annoyed, because we are in a world where we're told, hey, there is the need for growing the audience, the need for diversity. Now, people are talking about diversity in terms of other traits, and fine, but the need for diversity in the audience is more important, more talked about than ever before. And yet, the comics that are coming out appeal to a smaller set of people than ever before. And I don't mean smaller in terms of volume, I mean smaller just in terms of tone. And so you look at the CW and you look at what happened there. And you have to say, look, it's not healthy for any publisher, any content producer, whether it's comics, or whether it's TV, or whether it's media, whatever it happens to be. It's not healthy if their portfolio of stuff all starts to look the same, even if the stuff is that everybody's copying is really good. The other one, the defensiveness of the '90s is always amusing to me when I look in the comments, particularly when somebody comes in and it's like, the '90s were great. You don't know what you're talking about. The '90s were perfect. I am 27 years old and I love the 90s. It's like, okay, so you were how old when this was going on? 5? You were 5. So you understood the complexities of store closures and Marvel's bankruptcy and everything else. You remember that from being 5? Yeah, you're kind of proving my point because the stuff that you loved from the 90s is stuff that has been remembered. You're not seeing the other 60 comics that were sent to the bin. There were some good things out of the 90s, make no mistake about it. One of the bad lessons people took is that superstar artists like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee, Mark Silvestri, a number of other artists copied their styles, but weren't particularly good at it. And so you had all these books out there doing kind of Jim Lee or Rob Liefeld light, and they were crap. I mean, you did you wanted the original. You wanted a Jim Lee book drawn by Jim Lee. You didn't want a Jim Lee kind of parody book drawn by somebody trying to do Jim Lee but with a very vague understanding of human anatomy. That didn't work, and there was a ton of those. And that was one of the reasons why things tanked in the 90s, is because the good work was still good work, great comics. The bad stuff was cloned nonsense that just had no real flavor to it at all. That stuff has been forgotten. That stuff is gone. Whenever somebody comes in to defend the 90s, they're like, God, J. Scott Campbell is doing amazing work. You're right. He was. Great stuff. Absolutely. Good titles. Joe Mad, absolutely. Who didn't like that? It was some good stuff. But the other 10 artists trying to kind of half-ass their styles, yeah, that stuff sucked. Hands down, that stuff sucked. And that's the problem. Whenever you get too much of the same thing, and particularly when each clone starts to feel more watered down than the last, it doesn't help. Right now, I think if comics wants to be more successful, one of the things it will do is actually, shockingly, do what people decry: give diversity, go all in. But I'm talking diverse content. I'm talking diverse storytelling, diverse art styles. I'm talking about a wide range of material. If you're publishing 70 to 90 books a month, which is what the big two are doing, you have the portfolio, you have the room to do that. Now, granted, it takes more work to do that, but that's the only way you're going to be successful. There is no chance of success if you are just trying to kind of mimic, the one that feels comfortable. I was surprised. I sat down for the first time. I've been moving and everything else, and I sat down and read the last few weeks worth of comics, and I was shocked. Both, not as much with Marvel and DC, because this isn't a new thought, but on the indie side, how much everything was the same. I mean, you could bracket these books into 2 or 3 categories in style, and you're not meant to read all those comics all at once, all at the same time. But for a business that often prides itself on creative expression and being unique and being free to tell the stories you want to tell, it's a lot all the same. And as long as it's that, yeah, things are going to struggle. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the comments below, or in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. That's the thing. It's too early. I'm not adapting to Central Standard Time. I like my Pacific time. That was a better time. It was too early. Thanks for listening.